Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what I'm certain will be informative, engaging, and timely discussion. 22 years ago today, the Chinese Communist government launched a massive campaign of religious persecution in an attempt to eradicate Falun Gong. At the time, it was practiced by over 70 million people, according to a New York Times report. Even as those of us outside China scrambled to respond to the sudden new threat faced by our friends in China, few of us imagined the horrors that awaited. Decades of mass detentions, torture, and innocent lives being killed for their organs. Even less did we realize that the full impact that the Communist Party action would have beyond the community of Falun Gong practitioners, honing the party's repressive and censorship apparatus, costing the country billions of dollars, and undermining any semblance of rule of law or respect for religious freedom. We have just noticed today the U.S. State Department has issued a press statement calling on China to stop persecuting this peaceful group. The Falun Dafa Information Center is now putting together this panel to reflect not only the current state of this ongoing human rights crisis in China, but also on its long-term global impact, and as importantly, on what the U.S. can do to stop it and save lives. Again, thank you for being here. Let me now introduce our moderator for today, Sarah Cook, Research Director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, the Freedom House. Sarah leads the China research team at Freedom House, including its work on media and internet freedom through publications like China Media Bulletin and the recent report, Beijing's Global Megaphone. She also authored the 2017 report on religious revival, repression and resistance in China, titled The Battle for China's Spirit. It includes an excellent chapter on Falun Gong, among many other religious groups that I would highly recommend. Before joining Freedom House, Sarah co-edited the English translation of a memoir by the prominent human rights lawyer Gao Zhisheng, and was twice a delegate to the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva as an NGO representative for religious freedoms in China. Now let me hand it over to Sarah, please.
Thank you very much, Erping. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm really pleased to have been invited to moderate today's conversation. And as Erping mentioned, I had an opportunity to really take a deep dive into the specifics of the Communist Party's campaign against Falun Gong, as well as the resistance and responses from practitioners as part of this big 2017 report we did on religion in China. And I think one of the things that we came away with from that research and other research that Freedom House has done is just to really consistently look at and find the extremely high level of persecution that's faced by Falun Gong practitioners in China. Just the sheer scale of the detentions and imprisonment, the harshness of the prison sentences, and the deaths from abuse in custody. I think what was also really striking is that 22 years after the Chinese Communist Party declared that it was going to crush Falun Gong survives in China. And our estimates were that there were still millions, even maybe up to 20 million people still practicing in China. And that's pretty remarkable when you think about the size and ferocity of the security apparatus that the Communist Party has at its disposal. So in terms of today's discussion, so we have four excellent panelists, each with kind of knowledge and experience on this topic from a different perspective. So what we'll do is I'll introduce each of them and ask them a question in turn, and then we'll have kind of a moderated discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And you should be able to see, I think it'll probably be on the right hand of your screen, a slot where you can pose questions that then I, as the moderator, will be able to see, and I'll relay it to the panelists. When you ask your question, if there's a particular person you want to direct it to, then indicate that, or I can kind of hand them out based on who I think might be the best fit. So without further ado, we're going to start with Reverend Johnnie Moore, since I know Johnnie needs to depart a bit early. Reverend Moore is a former commissioner for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and really a long-term advocate for religious freedom in China and around the world. Interestingly, his fate became tied to that of Falun Gong just about 2 months ago, when Secretary of State Anthony Blinken announced sanctions against a Chinese official from the security apparatus in Sichuan province who had been involved in persecuting Falun Gong. And the Chinese government quickly responded with its own sanctions, though this time against Johnnie for supporting rather than for suppressing religious freedom. So Johnnie, maybe you could start us off with, some thoughts on how Falun Gong and really the party's campaign against it fit within the broader context of religious freedom and persecution in China, and why it's really important to keep this, example in mind when we're talking about the challenges that religious persecution in China poses today.
Well, first of all, Sarah, thank you for the question. Thanks to all the Falun Gong community that's watching, and others who are who feel as I do, and as you aptly said, that somehow all of our fate is tied to the fate of not only this community but communities like it in China and around the world that are affected by these atrocities. I mean, communism and religion have always had a complicated relationship, or anything that acts like religion. And one of the primary reasons why is because communism, in its heart, demands the subservience of people, and at all costs. Unlike the United States of America, where we've always viewed religious freedom as a strength of our government. It ensures that people can have free thoughts, that our marketplace of ideas is vibrant, that our competition in government and outside of government not only contributes to the free market, but make sure in the end the right ideas win. Communism, the problem with communism is that it suppresses individual people. And when you're a religious person, or you believe in some kind of transcendence, there's something that's higher than the power of government. In my case, I believe in God. I believe that God is the ultimate decider of all things. That my values are not determined by my government, or not determined by all kinds of other external factors. They're determined by humility, to recognize that as a human being, that I'm ultimately subservient to someone else. And that should call people to be good people, and to help their neighbor, and to care for one another, and to have fear of God, frankly, and to value that every human being is made in the image of God, and therefore it's not for government to biologically manipulate a human being or a population, or it's not for government to decide whether that person is free or not. This is a gift from God to humanity. So it is no surprise that in a communist party that is obsessed with power, that is obsessed with providing special privileges to a small group of elites, that when a community of loyal and devoted individuals has ideas of their own that aren't necessarily subservient to the government, not in contrivance of the government, not against the government, but complementary often to the government. Every Falun Gong practitioner I've ever met in China, and I met several in my visits to China, they love China. They're not anti-China. And in fact, unlike Marxism, the foundation of communism, which was imported into China, the Falun Gong rose up within China. It's not imported. It's not a foreign idea that was brought into the country. But I think what a lot of Americans, and sadly too few religious freedom and human rights advocates, realize is that there are far more religious Chinese people than there are members of the Communist Party. Maybe there are 90 million members of the Communist Party. So when you put together Falun Gong practitioners, the evangelical community, my own community, which now numbers substantially more than the number of members of the Communist Party, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, other ethnic and religious minorities that get less attention. The government has, rather than seeing this as China's greatest asset, its unbelievable history and diversity, has cravenly decided that their diversity and their independence and their reliance on something other than government in order to better their society, they've too often viewed it as a threat. And as we saw on this day 22 years ago, the full power of the Communist Party, decided to viciously target its own citizens. And too few people were screaming about it 22 years ago. And business people ignored it. And the world was quiet about it. And when I sit around and I hear people, and I'll finish here, Sarah, but when I hear people say that we didn't know what the Communist Party was doing to the Uyghurs, or we didn't know what the Communist Party was doing to other threatened communities, I'm sorry, but if we would have been paying attention to what they did on this day 22 years ago, we might have saved many, many, many more lives. And the fact of the matter is, China has nothing to fear from its diversity. The Communist Party itself has nothing to fear from these wonderful people, except for perhaps the loss of total totalitarian control, which is ultimately a dead end both for the country and for the party itself.
Thank you, Johnny. And I think that's a theme we'll probably, I think Levi may touch on more later in terms of, this incubation element of how is it that tactics used against Falun Gong you start to see being used against other groups. I'm mindful that you need to depart. And since one of the things you are versed in is, what do we do about this type of an issue? I just wanted to give you a chance before you had to hop off. We'll come back to this later with the other speakers. Is, what do you see that, whether it's the U.S. government in particular, but maybe also other, Americans, religious communities in the United States, that could do with regards to this particular human rights crisis in China, but maybe also more broadly with regards to persecution of religion in China?
Well, first of all, there are about 80 million evangelicals in the United States. That's almost a third of the electorate. Incredibly diverse community. We're increasingly, more Hispanic and Latino, African American. You hear a lot about white evangelicals, but we're actually this incredibly diverse religious community. Every evangelical in America needs to have a friend who's a part of the Falun Gong community and needs to hear firsthand about the community, and vice versa. Everybody in all of our communities ought to know the diaspora communities in places where there's persecution, because when we stand together, that's when we can make a difference on this issue. And thank God that despite how divided the United States of America is on this issue, we have bipartisanship like we almost have on nothing else in America. And in fact, I think one of the reasons why the Communist Party of China sanctioned me of all people is I think what they were attempting to do is they were attempting to further divide the United States of America. That's why they sanctioned dozens of former Trump administration officials on the day of Joe Biden's inauguration. They were attempting to exploit divisions in the United States of America. And like many things the Chinese Communist Party has attempted to do in the past, economic decisions, military decisions, all kinds of ways in which they've meddled with things. Well, this also backfired. And so what we're seeing total bipartisanship and standing up to China, the Communist Party in particular, not the Chinese people whom we love and admire both historically and present, and saying like, look, we love to do business with China. We love to create a better world with China and have cleaner air with China and all of these things. But the Chinese Communist Party doesn't get to make its own rules and act like that it's part of the international community. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't get to cause incomprehensible harm to the Chinese people and walk into the hallowed halls of the United Nations and tell everybody else what to do. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't get to travel around the world and give loans with strings attached to developing nations who want to rise out of poverty, just like the Chinese Communist Party says that they're responsible for in their own country, and then leave those countries with unfinished bridges and unfinished roads, and not employing local people but importing Chinese people, in order to accomplish these tasks. The bipartisanship must exist in the United States, and the Biden administration, along with the Republican Party as well, need to make sure that all of our allies are on the same page. And if they want to play ball, we play ball, and playing ball means the Congress needs to pass a bill, which, there's an amazing bill both in the House and the Senate, the stopped forced organ harvesting bill. Like, this should just fly through, and it should be signed by President Joe Biden. As long as these behaviors continue, we ought to keep sanctioning people. And if the cost, if the cost of that is that they sanction people like me, fine, whatever. What we want to do is we want to either across the table in good faith create a better world together, or the United States, which is still the sole superpower in the world, by a mile, needs to work with its allies to incentivize a change in behavior. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And in the United States, our politicians and our leaders respond to the people. And it's time that there are no Democrats and Republicans on this issue, but only Americans who don't want to hand the future of our world to the present condition of the Chinese Communist Party. And by the way, they don't fear Americans first in the party. They don't fear Americans first. They fear the Chinese people first. And this is my prayer every single day, that the leaders of China would stop seeing their own people as a threat, but the greatest blessing that they have as a country. And until they have that wake-up call, then all the governments in the world need to create this great wall of collaboration to make sure that even if they continue to commit these atrocities within their own borders, they're not allowed to export those around the world. And that's why I'm so proud to be here today, to stand with communities like the Falun Gong. And I hope that on each side of me and behind me, especially from our own community, there are tens of millions more.
Thanks very much, Johnny, and thank you for those comments. And I think one of the things that has been really nice to see is the level of bipartisanship that these kinds of issues are gaining, even in our very politically polarized system here in the U.S. I think it is really it's very encouraging. It does make it more effective because it makes it harder for the CCP to play divide and conquer. So I know you might need to drop off. Please do stay if you can, but if not, we'll drop off whenever you need to. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So I'm going to turn now to Levi Browde, and Levi is actually a software entrepreneur turned rights advocate, who's also the executive director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, the organization hosting today's panel, and has really been a long time, observer and activist with regards to folks, suffering persecution in China, in terms of Falun Gong practitioners. So Levi's is taking a bit of a step back, but for those of us in the audience who, those who might not be familiar, can you kind of give a brief rundown of, what Falun Gong is and why is the CCP so committed to persecuting practitioners and effectively trying to eradicate the practice in China, even 22 years later after they initially launched this campaign to do so?
Sure, Sarah. Thank you. Many people have seen Falun Gong in the headlines, but still the knowledge about exactly what it is, exactly what's happening in China is sometimes lost. So let me cover some very basics. Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based spiritual practice. It has a tradition that goes back thousands of years, but was only first made public in China in 1992. It became an instant sensation. Tens of millions of people started practicing. In fact, a government survey by the end of the decade found that there's 70 to 100 million people practicing. That's more than the members of the Communist Party. It's an enormous number of people. At the very end of 1999, the top leader, Jiang Zemin of the Communist Party at that time, saw in Falun Gong the size, the fact that it was a resurgence of spirituality and traditional culture that the Marxist government had been trying to suppress for decades, and also saw in Falun Gong what he thought was an easy target to create a sort of a big political campaign to build up his own sort of a cult of personality around himself. So for all these reasons, he unilaterally ordered that Falun Gong be eliminated in the summer of 1999. And that night, 22 years ago, and people were literally pulled from their beds in Gestapo-style fashion in the middle of the night. Very soon, tens of thousands of people had been detained. And so what we've seen over the last 22 years is these millions and millions of people who practice or advocate for Falun Gong being subject to wrongful detention, illegal imprisonment, torture, or even death. We've also seen, out of the persecution of Falun Gong, the arising of this terrible atrocity of of a significant number of people being killed for their vital organs. So that's really what's been happening for the last 22 years.
And when we look at, I guess, the situation right now, maybe you could give us a quick update of what's happening, both in China as well as in Hong Kong. I guess especially in terms of how events of the last, say, 2 years compared to the previous 20. Are things getting worse? Are they getting better? How many people are still being impacted by all of this? Maybe you can give us a kind of a rundown of where things stand right now.
Sure. Despite the pandemic, when you think activity in general would go down, what we've seen over the last 18 months is a significant increase in the persecution as it's measured in arrests or something we call harassment, that which could be, police break into your home in the middle of dinner, they beat somebody up, they ransack your home, they extort money from you, but they don't actually take you into detention. So we'd call that a harassment. So just to give you a sense of this, from the first half of 2019 to the first half of 2020, arrests increased 100%. And keep in mind, first half of 2020, much of China was under a lockdown, and yet those arrests went up that much. If you looked at those harassment cases between last year, 2020, the first half, and the first half of this year, they've gone up 200%. Sentencing over that 18-month period has gone up 60%. So all this is going up. It's going up while a lot of China was in a lockdown. What's going on? There's really three reasons we would point to. The first is the pandemic itself. And what I mean by that is Falun Gong, while a persecuted religious minority, it has also developed a vast network involving millions of people inside China that get reports of human rights abuses and other crimes going on inside China out of China and document those so that human rights workers outside China, governments can see what's going on. Well, it doesn't just report on what's happening to Falun Gong, and we've had a lot of people were, for example, taking pictures of what's happening around Wuhan and Beijing and reporting the true story of the pandemic. And for that reason, they were arrested or imprisoned, things of that nature. So that's one of the reasons we saw an increase. The second reason is something called the Zero Out campaign. It's the latest installment of this 22-year persecution, where there's a much more consolidated effort to try and get the number of practitioners in a given area down to zero. And they're using a number of techniques, escalating the harassments, escalating their use of technology, and putting people on blacklists so they can't travel, they can't get a job, they can't buy certain things, things of that nature. So that Zero Out campaign, that surge, is also affected the increase over the last 18 months. What we've also seen, the third reason, is the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, which just passed. This date, like many sensitive dates around China, the CCP will make a concerted effort to go after people who would normally report the truth, what was really going on in the country, or in this case, divulge the real history of the CCP. And so trying to clamp down on the Falun Gong community was a priority in preparing for the 100-year anniversary to make sure as few people as possible were talking about what the CCP really is, what its history really has been, how many people they've really killed. So for those three reasons, a significant uptick in the number of people being harassed, sentenced, imprisoned, arrested, and so on across China.
Thanks. That's really interesting. I think sometimes some of these trends are kind of counterintuitive because you think, oh, it's been going on for so long. As we were saying during the pandemic, maybe things might have slowed down, but it seems like it hadn't. So now, I'd really like to turn to our next speaker, to Weiyu Wang, who can really give a firsthand sense of really how this campaign has affected the lives of ordinary Chinese citizens. Weiyu is also a software engineer. There are a lot of techies among the Falun Gong community, I think you'll find, who was pursuing a PhD at the prestigious Tsinghua University, really one of the most prestigious universities in China, in 1999, when the CCP banned Falun Gong. And he's just one of the many millions of people whose lives were really turned upside down. And he was subsequently jailed because of his beliefs and his rights activism, but was able to flee China and come to the United States several years ago. So Weiyu, maybe you could start, by giving us a sense of Well, what was it like to practice Falun Gong in Beijing? You know, in the late '90s, before the ban. You know, how you came across the practice yourself, and then what changed for you and some of the people around you. You know, on July 20th, 1999, when the orders came down to essentially wipe out and ban Falun Gong.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Hopefully you can hear me clearly. I'm so sorry. Suddenly my camera cannot work. I just realized that. So sorry about that. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Weiyu Wang. I was born in Shandong province in China, 1973. In 1996, I got my bachelor's degree and was recommended to pursue a doctorate at Tsinghua University. The next year, I started practicing Falun Gong. After I entered Tsinghua, I knew about the practice because Falun Gong meditation had been freely and openly practiced in all parks, communities, and schools for years. There were crowds of Falun Gong practitioners, you know, meditating peacefully in public space every single day. So in January 1997, during the first semester of my doctorate program, when I saw the book of Falun Gong, I immediately picked up. The book's contents discuss the moral principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance, an idea so attractive that I could not help but finish reading it in a few hours. I deeply realized that this is what I want. This is how people should live. To be a good person is determined by human nature inside, and to deviate from this principle is actually to betray one's own soul. And hundreds of people on campus welcomed me to realize this wish for spirituality. As far as I recall, there were 11 total groups of practitioners with more than 500 students and teachers meditating daily at Tsinghua. But ever since the Chinese Communist Party, led by Jiang Zemin, CCP, carried out a severe persecution of Falun Gong in mainland China from 1999, my family and I experienced oppression and torture for 14 years. I was forced to suspend my schooling twice and give up my doctorate degree due to this wide-scale persecution. For nearly a decade, I was jailed and brutally tortured in prison by CCP authorities in Tianjin. I was sentenced at age 29 and lost my 30s due to the crackdown on religion. Even after my release, I was closely monitored by police and CCP agents. In the fall semester of 1999, the CCP deputy secretary of my department at Tsinghua asked my classmates to condemn me one by one in a classroom for more than 2 hours. This was a familiar classroom filled with familiar faces, and I was suddenly brought to stand before thousands of them, defenseless and forced to listen. I still cannot forget the face of my close friend, who stood up and threatened me. If you keep your belief in Falun Gong, I will stab you to death. I was very astonished at that time. I had no idea that the propaganda could change a person in such a dramatic way. In August 2002, after I was expelled from the university on the grounds of my spirituality, I was just walking down the street when I was suddenly thrown onto the ground by a group of strangers. They knocked my glasses off my face and then stepped on my head. This violence surprised the passers-by, and some of them stopped and watched. The assailants told the pedestrians that I was a thief. I shouted back, I'm a Falun Gong practitioner, not a thief. They were so scared at my words. They quickly covered my mouth and stuffed me into a car. Then they drew me to a secret place that was especially made for detaining Falun Gong practitioners, called the Legal Training Center. There, I was beaten and electric shocked endlessly from 6 p.m. to 5 a.m. the next day. The so-called trainers would shock my neck while graining with electric batons continuously until the batons ran out of power. Then they plugged electric batons directly into the sockets and continued to electrocute me. I was shocked all over my body, including all 10 fingertips, and they even pierced 2 electrodes into my back. The authorities would jump to smash my head with their elbows, called me a counter-revolutionist, and shouted with glee, to scorch every inch of skin. During the next 6 months, they locked me in solitary confinement, and almost everything was forbidden, including talking, knowing the date or time, or even using the toilet. Going to the restroom required an application, but those requests were nearly all denied. Also, I was kidnapped in the summer with only the clothes on my body. So in the winter, I had to hug my legs tightly to resist the coldest days of Beijing. The severe living conditions led to muscle atrophy. Every night, I fell asleep to the sharp sound of whiplashes and horrible shrieks of women being tortured. During this period, my parents were not allowed to know my condition or my location, and these horrible days were not even regarded as a term of detention by the CCP government. Next, I was sent into Fengtai and Chaoyang detention center in Beijing. These centers kept Falun Gong practitioners on the edge of starvation. Even the jailers would say, "There's no human rights here." But the court judges would just shrug those complaints off and reply, "This judgment was not made by me, and I'm just following orders." In 2004, I was sent into Qianjin prison, where jailers chose special criminals to monitor us 24/7. These criminals are usually felons, such as murderers, robbers, and drug traffickers, and the jailers offer them a reduced prison term by harassing Falun Gong practitioners. If I even give other practitioners a second glance, they would report it to the jailers. We were forced to labor outside, planting radishes, weeding, digging, and do factory work like wrapping candies, making paper muffin cups, and sports balls like volleyballs. While sewing those balls by hand, a practitioner pierced his eyeball with iron crochet by accident. Because we didn't have any protective equipment, even now, I can't eat those candies and muffins because now I know they were made through forced labor. Prisoners are punished cruelly if they cannot complete their work on time, including sleep and food deprivation, electric shock, and severe beating. We are modern-day slaves. But even despite these horrid conditions, the CCP sat in front of us proudly. Who is capable of knowing what happens in Chinese prisons? If any international groups come, what they can see is a beautiful prison, and what they can hear is only praise. Thus, when you hear any good words from the Uyghurs in Xinjiang labor camp or any prisoners in Chinese prisons, please be aware that those fake words are just reflecting the brutal behavior of CCP. Only dictators need such lies to cover their crimes. I cannot list all the brutal things I saw and experienced in China here today, but I want to make it clear. I want to make it clear that the Chinese Communist Party is not just persecuting Falun Gong practitioners or Chinese people. All the democratic countries, especially the United States, have been on their agenda for many decades. Economic profit is just their lure. We have no other options but to wake up now. By the way, one of the wardens told me, "Tell your friends overseas, don't write letters to me again." And through the endless years of oppression under the party, I finally realized that they are afraid of something after all, voices of justice. So your voice really matters. Darkness is always afraid of being exposed to the light. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Weiyu. It's really so powerful to hear the firsthand account of someone who's lived through, some of the, bigger picture, examples that Levi was giving. I think one of the things that happened, in the early years of the persecution against Falun Gong, as Falun Gong practitioners demonstrated their resilience in the face of the CCP's campaign is that we saw Chinese officials starting to deploy more and more violence. And in the early 2000s, that was also a period when China was expanding a nascent organ transplant industry. But hospitals were finding it difficult to procure organs because of the absence or non-existence, really, of a voluntary donation system, and also a cultural reticence by many Chinese to donate their organs. So we're going to turn now to Dr. Jessica Russo, who's a clinical psychologist from Philadelphia and also a member of the board of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. That's a research and advocacy group comprised of medical professionals who are dedicated to stopping organ transplant abuses, especially in China. So Dr. Russo, maybe you could break down, kind of what the connection is between the CCP's campaign against Falun Gong and organ transplant abuses and procurement issues that we see in China.
Sure. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for coming today. There is a direct connection. We've heard reference today of how the persecution of Falun Gong is a campaign of annihilation. So forced organ harvesting is one of their main ways of eliminating Falun Gong practitioners. At the same time, it's a way for the government to gain a significant profit and set their position as the largest provider of organ transplants in the whole world. So I want to also mention that forced organ harvesting as a form of elimination is not just simply to eliminate this group, but it really is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many experts, an act of genocide. Because clearly there is intent there. Levi referenced this earlier, that the initiator of the persecution of Falun Gong, Jiang Zemin, talked about sort of a three-prong approach to dealing with Falun Gong. And one of them was to destroy them physically, to eliminate them. So the intent was very strong to get rid of this group. They thought they would be able to do it in a few weeks. So this is very concerning, that they want to destroy this group, and particularly they want to destroy the values that Falun Gong represents, which are universal values which we all hold very dear. Johnnie spoke earlier about these important values and how the Chinese government needs these just as much as anybody else does, because these are humanitarian values. So this is, in essence, what they are destroying. And specifically for Falun Gong, we're talking about truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance.
Jessica, are you still there?
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. So if you could, I guess, share a little bit more about, what, again, how do we know that organ harvesting is happening? How is it targeting? It seems something so outlandish. I know I myself have looked at some of it, and when you look at things like short waiting times, maybe you could give, I guess, maybe 2 or 3 points that would help people who maybe aren't so familiar with the issue to just get a sense of, what is it and how is it happening, and how is Falun Gong related to that in terms of this campaign?
Sure. Well, let me start from the beginning. I think it's important to define what forced organ harvesting is. Forced organ harvesting in China is very different than what we see in any other part of the world. This is not black market organ trade or trafficking. This is state-initiated, state-sanctioned, and it's going on throughout the entire country. They are using Falun Gong practitioners primarily, but generally prisoners of conscience, as the organ source. And it's really a form of torture. Practitioners, any other person who is subject to this procedure, is not given any anesthesia. They're strapped down. They're often given an agent that paralyzes them, but they can still feel. And because they're taking their vital organs, as you noted before, this is inevitably killing them. So it's a form of execution, and a form of mass murder. And we know this is happening from 15 years of research. And just last year in March, a People's Tribunal in London called the China Tribunal declared that this is happening on a significant scale. It has been happening for a long time, primarily to Falun Gong practitioners. And there's also evidence that the Uyghurs are subject to this. So we know that the Chinese Communist Party has a very long history of using prisoners. This goes back to the 1970s. In 2014, Wang Jiefu, the former deputy health minister and now current head of the voluntary organ donation system, acknowledged that over 90% of organs came from executed prisoners. But no one in the Communist Party has acknowledged that these organs are primarily from prisoners of conscience. Except, really by accident, the researchers that were looking into this issue spoke with medical personnel from 15 hospitals in China who ended up disclosing that, yes, we have Falun Gong practitioners' organs. This is mainly what we use. And they were boasting about the quality of the organs because Falun Gong practitioners, through their practice, are very healthy. We also know that the voluntary donation rate in China is very low. So that would not account for the massive transplantation infrastructure that we see today in China. In 2018, there were about 0.3% of the entire Chinese population had donated their organs, really small amount. And this is really because of a cultural taboo that the body should remain intact after death. The government has always said we transplant about 10,000 organs per year. Research in 2016 looked at that number. Previously, they had looked at who was the organ source, and they took the number 10,000, they accepted that. But in 2016, researchers started from the beginning, not only checking into the organ source at that point, but looking at how many transplants were being done. They looked at bed utilization rates, surgical teams, newsletters that the government was putting out, all sorts of different factors that told them actually it wasn't 10,000, it was between 60 to 100,000 transplants were being done per year. And this is a lot more than the United States. The United States did 39,000 last year. So that just gives you an example of how massive this is. And unfortunately, our media are not covering this. And that is intentional. And I want to just give you a brief example of this. In 2015, there was a reporter for the New York Times, Didi Kirsten Tatlow, who wrote a story about forced organ harvesting. She was based in China. But by the time the story was published, there was no reference to forced organ harvesting. The editors had completely cut that out, and they made it very clear to her. She testified at the China Tribunal. They made it clear that they did not want any of this reported. One editor said, well, the government had promised that they would stop using prisoners, so it's the end of the story. There's nothing there to report. Someone else said, well, this is mostly coming from Falun Gong reports, and Falun Gong, they're not a reliable source. And so it was completely squashed. And this is the kind of thing that we see throughout the media, whether it's newspapers, television. People do not want to report this. So it becomes a huge problem.
Thank you, Jessica. And I think for myself, when I was looking at this, those accidental admissions from doctors and some of those recordings, I think it wasn't just when the doctors were saying that that there were Falun Gong organs available, but also when, in some cases, it said they weren't, but if you go to so-and-so province, you can get them there. And that to me was even more chilling because it's not like somebody's just trying to sell someone something and say, yeah, we have it. They're basically actually revealing that there is some kind of distribution system or whatnot. So I want to, we're getting closer to the time when we're going to wrap up. So I just want to invite members of the audience. You should be able to see a place to type out some questions, and I'll keep an eye on them. So please feel free to type them out and, see, you can direct them to a particular speaker, or feel free, or I can kind of share them among others. So please feel free to write in any questions. I think in the meantime, while you have a chance to write out some of your questions, I just wanted to turn to you, Levi, because I think when we look at some of what we've heard today, whether it's from Jessica, from what you said, from what Weiyu was speaking about, clearly the campaign against Falun Gong has had a dramatic and a horrific impact on the lives of those who practice Falun Gong in China and their families and people who know them. But when you look at it, there's also obviously this broader impact in China. And I was wondering if you could talk about that. How do you see what the CCP has done to Falun Gong, or how Falun Gong has responded, as having, I guess, broader implications for how those of us, think about China, especially China today, but just overall think about how these types of human rights crises may go beyond, the human rights and religious freedom space? Oh, Levi, you're still muted.
Thank you. So there's a couple, that's a very good question. There's a couple of areas I think that to focus on in terms of what is this broader impact and why does it matter. The first is the point that I think Johnny touched upon, where the persecution of Falun Gong was really an incubator for suppression more broadly in China and even outside of China. And that spans a variety of areas. For example, there are torture techniques that were literally refined in certain labor camps, and the heads of those camps would train other camps because they were more effective in, quote unquote, breaking a Falun Gong practitioner or brainwashing somebody to give up their faith. And then they can deploy these torture techniques on other groups, such as the Uyghurs, House Christians, Tibetans, things like that. So we're seeing that kind of impact from the persecution. We're also seeing that there's a flip side to that, and that is Falun Gong, as I mentioned earlier, literally has millions of people inside China that are engaged in this peaceful grassroots distribution of information network. They literally print out leaflets in their living rooms and go out at night and spread these leaflets around their town or their village, which counteracts the state-run media, because that's all anybody ever sees inside China. And this has been very, very powerful on many fronts. In one respect, in some locales, you've had security agencies, police, who've gotten so much information about what's really going on and how horrific this is, they've said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And so there's been pockets of little pockets around China where it's really had an effect on literally stopping persecution. It's also had a great effect in terms of getting information from the West into China, like these sanctions. When these sanctions came down, that in May against someone in the security apparatus there, that sent shockwaves throughout China. And suddenly you have police chiefs who are either letting Falun Gong go, or they're trying to hide their tracks in terms of what they really do and their connection with an agency that persecutes Falun Gong. So it has a huge ripple effect. So the grassroots peaceful defiance movement, I would call it, inside China is enormously impactful for helping the Chinese people not only understand the persecution of Falun Gong, but helping them understand the nature of the CCP that's ruling them and the terrible crimes that have gone on for so long there.
Yeah, I think I think it's really interesting when we think about, this element of kind of the information control. And Weiyu, I think you were sentenced to prison actually for essentially kind of jumping the Great Firewall and accessing, I think, the Minghui website. I think that was one of the things that you were punished for. You maybe want to say a few words about, what was going on in China, or how you were caught. Do you know how they found out that you were engaging in this kind of behavior and then sentenced you to prison?
Yes, I think before I was expelled from Tsinghua University, the leaders in the university just told me, if you still keep your belief in Falun Gong, we will arrest you. We will arrest you. Just alert me. That is what they will do. They just do what they are, just according to their plan. So even I'm trying to hide here and there. Every 3 months, I have to move to a different location, but they still try their best. They are using all the police in Beijing try to catch me. That is one day when I was working in a company. That the company is a foreign company because I cannot find any job in China. So they just followed me. I don't know. I didn't know at that time, and they just arrest. They did not show anything. They just hit me onto the ground and then just put me into the car and drove away. So I don't know what happened at that time. And then after I was arrested in a so-called training center, and there, this is a black prison. Nobody knows the location. And there, they just drew my blood because they did a lot of blood testing, and they don't. Usually, the Falun Gong practitioners are treated very badly. I think maybe much worse than other criminals, but they just try to do a lot of physical examination, especially the blood testing. So this looks very weird. I don't think they care about our body or our health. They just care about our blood. So at that time, I know nothing about those things, but my family just told me, take care. Don't let them draw your blood or something, or don't do any physical examination. I don't understand that. I didn't understand at that time because I didn't hear anything about organ harvesting. I was arrested too early, something like 2002. But later, I just realized that okay, there is something like this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that first caught people's attention when they were looking at the organ harvesting issue is this, this element of the blood testing. I remember having interviewed some previous Falun Gong practitioners who had been prisoners and never even thinking to ask that question, and going back afterwards, after the information about potential organ harvesting issues came out, asking them and being really shocked that they were like, yeah, I never thought to say that when they were telling me about other abuse they'd suffered. It just seemed like something that had happened, and they hadn't really understood the significance of it at the time. But then later understood that seemed to have been connected to, to identifying this kind of reverse matching, which is what enables the waiting times in China to be so short for organ transplant recipients. So we're almost out of time, and actually many of the questions that we're seeing from the audience relate to what was going to be a last question I was going to ask each of you. And that is, what's something that, an ordinary person who's not a U.S. government official, one person is in the United Kingdom and wants to know how they could get involved in trying to help. Another person saw, the rally in Washington, D.C., and they just wanted to know, what they could do. So I think that would be one question that maybe, each of you could maybe answer briefly before we wrap up. And any other last thoughts that you wanted to share with our audience? Levi, why don't you go ahead first?
Okay. One thing I would say is a lot of people ask me, like, why haven't I heard about this? And I think there has been, over these last 22 years, an enormous effort on every single Chinese diplomatic mission around the world to suppress and marginalize Falun Gong in the countries in which they operate. And they go after our government officials, they go after our companies, they go after our media. And so there is an enormous pressure on a lot of our own institutions, including our media, including our government people, not to say anything about Falun Gong. And yet, as Johnnie had mentioned, that's something they're very afraid of, is that this all getting out into the open, because the crimes have been so horrific. I mean, forced organ harvesting, the scale and the amount of torturing of Falun Gong people, that's one of the things they're really afraid of. So how do we get that out into the open? I think there's a couple things. One is, and this is something we do a lot, is that in your community group, if you belong to a club or a church or just a neighborhood organization, you can go to our website and schedule a speaker to come to your community and give you sort of a presentation on exactly what's happening around China, so everybody becomes aware. That helps a great deal. There's also the two government actions we just talked about, more sanctions by our federal government, and you can write to the president, you can write to sort of other people in Department of State and say that's something you want to see. And this important legislation that's before our Congress now on forced organ harvesting, which again, as Johnny had mentioned, really should be a no-brainer. It really should go in very, very bipartisan. But pick up the phone, call your representatives and say, you care about this. This needs to pass. There's no reason it shouldn't. So those are the three things I'd say. Call us, let us do a presentation for your group, get a hold of the White House and the Department of State, and talk to your representatives.
Thank you, Levi. Jessica, what would you say to folks who, want to get involved?
Yep. Very similar to what Levi said. There's a lot that ordinary people can do. And certainly you can contact us at DAFO.org. That's Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting.org. And we can come in to your organization, to your club, and do a presentation. We've done lots of forums and panels. You can, first and foremost, just talk to anybody you know about this. Because media is so silent, there's a lot we can do to kind of act as that mouthpiece where we let people know what's happening. So whether we're at the dinner table with our families, or we're at church or synagogue, or wherever we might be, at work, by the water cooler, we can talk to people about what's happening in China. And absolutely calling our representatives to say, please support these pieces of legislation, a bill both in the House and in the Senate.
Thank you. And Weiyu, I know you had kind of spoken a little bit about what you felt people could do. So I think if you have any recommendations, that would be great. I think if you mentioned people writing letters. I think if there's anything else that, you've encountered that has really, you've seen be helpful, that was something that someone outside of China, whether they were American or from another country, had done, that you would like to share, I think that would be great as well.
Yes, I think they are afraid of the truth. Just to spread the truth to anybody you can touch. Just tell them what happened in China. Just tell them my story, and even you think your voice is not so important, but it's not true. Your voice really matters, and you can even call the officials in China and tell them, don't do that, don't persecute Falun Gong practitioners. All the things you can do. It's very helpful, and just let people outside China know the things is also very helpful for the practitioners in China or others persecuted by the CCP. So just spreading the truth. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I would just add that actually the Falun Dafa Information Center website is a really great resource. I think there's also social media accounts that I think Cynthia has been posting. But you see a lot of, there's some great videos, some really thoughtful analysis, links to third-party reports, from human rights groups like Freedom House, like Amnesty, news reports, kind of all in one place. And so I think that can also be a resource. I think Levi they have a newsletter too, that you can sign up to there. And I think the thing I would add, and I know Levi had planned to touch on this and we didn't really get to it, is that the persecution of communities like Falun Gong is happening not only in China. Freedom House has been doing a new project on what's called transnational repression, which is really the way in which the repression from governments like China's and the Chinese Communist Party reaches beyond China's borders. And actually, we found that the CCP engages in the largest and most sophisticated campaign of transnational repression in the world, reaching dozens of countries around the world. And one of the target groups is Falun Gong. In fact, one of the longest running target groups is Falun Gong. And there were incidents here in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America, really pretty much all over the world. Even as we're seeing other communities like Uyghurs or Hong Kongers being targeted too. So I think that's also something that, people can keep in mind and keep your eyes open. In the sense that, some of this is also actually happening here, and there may be members of your own communities that, that are encountering harassment, phone calls from the Chinese consulate, surveillance, even when they're outside of China in a democratic country. We've pretty much reached the limit of our time. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you very much to our speakers. This was really, really a rich discussion that really touched on so many facets of this. It was really, really quite touching to also hear Weiyu's personal experience. So anyway, I think we'll wrap up there. And as I mentioned, I think you can visit the Falun Dafa Information Center's website and also sign up for their email newsletter, and that's where there's various updates on opportunities to be engaged as they emerge. Thank you, everyone.